I told my mom I found out the truth. She collapsed before I even said the word DNA. I am a 31-year-old woman, and my mother was halfway between the kitchen and the hall when her knees folded. The mug slipped, tea spread like a dark wing across the tile, and she went down without a sound except the small clatter of her bracelet against the floor. I had only said, I found out the truth. I hadn't reached the word that scared both of us. She came back quickly, eyes fluttering, breath shallow, insisting she was fine, waving away my phone when I said ambulance. I slid a cushion under her head and watched the pulse in her neck stutter and steady. The kettle clicked off behind us. Outside, a dog barked like the world hadn't changed. It had started as a gift I didn't ask for. Someone at work passed around discounted kits during a wellness week, joking about finding Vikings and royalty in our spit. I loved charts, not drama. I mailed the tube with the same diligence I used on expense reports and forgot about it until an email subject blinked. Your DNA results are ready. The percentages were cute until they weren't. The ancestry map was a watercolor that made me want to book flights, but the relatives tab was a trapdoor. At the top was a match labeled, close family, 73% shared DNA, likely parent/child. The name was a stranger, Thomas Hale, 52, living 2 towns away. Below him, a cluster of people I did not recognize, none with my mother's maiden name. My father, the man who raised me, had never taken a test. The algorithm didn't care. It drew lines anyway. I told myself there were explanations. Data entry error. A relative I'd never met that the system mislabeled. I squinted at the fine print until it blurred. Then I clicked message before I could talk myself out of it and wrote to Thomas, "Hi, this is strange. The site says we're close family. Do you know any hearts?" I hovered over send and pressed my thumb down. He replied before the hour was out. His note was careful. He'd been contacted by a few surprises since his son gave him a kit last Christmas. He asked for my mother's name and whether she'd ever lived in Brookline. The word Brookline put a dent in the air around me. My mother had lived there for 1 year before she married my father, a story told in soft focus, always with a shrug and the sentence, "It was a phase." I did what people do when the floor shifts. I grabbed at other floors. I dug out a shoebox of old papers from the hall closet. In it, a yellowed vaccination record with my newborn blood type, B+. My father's wallet had always carried his donor card, O-. In 10th grade biology, we'd done Punnett squares with gumdrops. I remembered the rules that seemed like magic. B from where, if not him? I googled like a lunatic and tried to build a bridge between impossible squares. The bridge kept collapsing. I tried to float the subject with my mother 2 weeks ago, lightly, like curiosity. She smiled too hard and told me a set of stories that wanted to be true. Tests are wrong all the time, mislabeling happens, these companies make their money on drama. Then she told me to trust her, to let the past be the past. She put her hand on mine and said exactly, "I need you to choose me over strangers." It sounded like love and a dare. After her collapse, I helped her onto the couch. She sipped water and said her blood pressure was misbehaving. Her face had the slackness of someone who has run out of positions to stand in. I didn't push. I had learned that pushing only builds better walls. I asked instead about the winter she lived in Brookline. She closed her eyes and said she didn't remember much. It was a lie. My mother remembers the exact dates of every dentist appointment I have ever had. That night I wrote everything down in a notebook, dates, names, tiny details that could get lost in the Rorschach. My father's birthday. The year my parents married. The year I was born. The one blurry photo from her Brookline phase, where she's on a porch in a flannel shirt, hair wind-tangled, a guitar leaning against the railing that no one in our family has ever played. I drew a line between that picture and the name on the screen, Thomas Hale. When I was a kid, I'd ask where my music ear came from, and both my parents would point at each other as a joke. Now my mind replayed the gesture in slow motion and found a different punchline. I thought of my father helping me tune the cheap keyboard he'd bought from a yard sale, frowning at the instructions like he could invent a solution with his hands. I thought of holidays where he would retreat to the garage when the house got loud. I tried to remember if I looked like him. I tried to remember which of my features my mother had claimed with pride and which she'd laughed off as a mix. The math made me nauseous. The next morning, my Aunt Lila called because my mother must have told her some version of "I'm not well." Lila has the voice of a person who has never been surprised by bad weather. She asked if I could sit with Mum for a few days. I said I could. Then I asked a question that sounded casual and wasn't, whether Mum had a rough winter before she married. The beat of silence was long enough to grow something in. Lila said softly that there was a boy with a motorcycle who didn't make it to spring. Then she paused as if deciding which drawer held which truth and added that there were other boys who only made it to photo albums, and some albums had pages torn out. 2 days later, Thomas asked if we could speak by phone. I went to my car so the walls couldn't listen. His voice was older and kind. He told me his wife had died years ago, that he'd made the kit to give his son medical history. He said he had 2 confirmed surprises before me, both from the same summer, and none from before or after. He apologized for existing in a way that made me want to throw my phone into a lake. He asked if my mother's name was Anne, with an E. I asked him why he thought he recognized her. He said there was a photo he'd kept in a box he should have thrown away, a porch, a guitar, wind, a girl who left without a forwarding address. I pointed at the truth as if it were a wild animal and said it might be safer to circle it. He agreed. We hung up with more questions than we'd begun. My father came by that evening with soup he had bought from the deli and put in our bowls like he'd made it. He nudged the spoon closer when my mother didn't eat. He talked about weather systems and a neighbor's fence leaning the wrong way. He did not say, "Why does the air in here feel like a courtroom?" I watched the way he moved around her, careful, practiced, as if this were not new. My loyalty tried to split itself and failed. In the days that followed, my mother's posture changed. She began to narrate cautionary tales about people being destroyed by curiosity. She floated hypotheticals in which DNA was a colonial map drawn with a dull pencil. She became generous with memories that proved nothing: the first time she saw my father's smile, the dress she wore when they danced the night before their wedding, the exact weight of me when I was placed in her arms. The details were true, the story attached to them didn't need to be. Gaslighting, I wrote in my notebook in tiny letters, then felt disloyal and crossed it out, then wrote it again because my stomach knew what my hand didn't want to. While she napped, I went through a desk drawer she used for important things. I wasn't hunting, I was confirming. There, under warranties and a stack of church bulletins, was a thin envelope from a clinic long shuttered. The letter inside was brittle with age. The letterhead said Brookline Women's Health. The date was 8 months before I was born. The line that stopped my breath was a phrase with no poetry: artificial insemination, donor known to patient. My mother had not told me an affair story. She had told me nothing. The truth was mechanical and intimate, chosen and hidden. I put the letter back where I'd found it because I wasn't ready to hold anything heavier. Then I made a copy with my phone, hands shaking so hard the flash fired twice. That evening, when she woke, I told her I had found out the truth. The sentence felt like stepping onto ice that might hold. She tried to stand. She didn't make it as far as the hall. After I helped her to the couch, she pressed her fingers into her eyes and whispered that she had wanted a child more than she'd wanted anything. She said my father didn't make good numbers, an awful phrase I wish I could unhear. She said they couldn't afford a clinic with locks on the doors and proper paperwork, so they'd done it through someone her friend knew, a man who wanted no part of anything, a man with a guitar who thought secrets were vaccinations. She said my father had agreed because he loved her. She said he had asked one thing, that they never speak of it again. The story made a kind of sense that hurt every part of me. It wasn't a soap opera, it was a decision made in a small kitchen at a square table by 2 people who were tired of waiting. But she had mounted herself on the altar of courage and expected applause for surviving her own secret. I asked why, after all these years, she still chose hiding. She said because the truth would kill my father's pride, and pride is the last thing some men have. She said she was protecting me from the cruelty of people who call biology the only real word. She said, again, that I needed to choose her. I thought of the letter in the drawer and the name on the screen and the porch with a guitar and the timeline I'd drawn in a notebook like a person building a raft out of receipts. I told her quietly that choosing her didn't require agreeing to be blind. She stared at me as if I'd refused rescue. Down the hall, the fridge motor sighed on. Somewhere outside, a car door thudded. In my throat, a familiar ache started, the one you get when you try to keep two incompatible truths from splitting you. My mother was the woman who had cut my sandwiches into triangles and taught me to point at the sky when words failed. She was also the woman who had decided the truth was too dangerous for me to survive, so she built me a story instead. Thomas sent one more message that night. His son wanted to know if he had a sister. I didn't answer. I put the phone face down and sat on the floor of the hallway outside my bedroom, back against the wall, head tipped until it touched the plaster. I could hear my father's voice in the garage of my memory, saying things like, "Fix the leak, not the paint." I didn't know yet which part was leaking. I knew only that paint would ruin everything. For the first time in my life, I approached my father like a source. Not to cross-examine, but to give him a door. I drove to his workshop on a Tuesday when he was least likely to have drop-ins. The place smelled like metal filings and old coffee. He didn't look surprised to see me. He wiped his hands on a rag that once had been a shirt and asked if I'd eaten. I said I needed to tell him something. He listened the way he always had when the car made a new noise, brow furrowed, eyes soft, attention full. I told him I'd taken a test. I said I'd found a name. I explained the letter in the drawer without accusing anyone of anything. I was careful with nouns. When I reached the word donor, his fingers tightened against the rag until his knuckles went pale. He stared past me at the drill press. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded like it had been left out in weather. He said he had known, and the sentence rearranged my idea of the world. He said he'd stood in a clinic office staring at a door that looked like any door and agreed to a future in which biology would be a fact without being a story. He said he had loved me since before I was cells, and the idea of sharing me with a man who could walk away made him angry in a way that scared him. He said he'd kept the secret because he thought it would keep us whole. He said my mother had paid for that decision in small, constant ways. Every time a stranger said I had his eyes, she had to swallow a truth that didn't fit anywhere. He looked at me as if assessing whether I could survive the rest and then added that pride had a way of disguising itself as protection. I asked if he wanted me to pretend nothing had changed. He said he wanted me to keep calling him Dad. He said if I went looking for anyone else, I should do it gently. He said he did not want to meet a guitar on a porch. He smiled, and it was the same crooked smile that had calmed me when I was 5 and a storm sounded bigger than our roof. I drove home with the windows cracked to cut the smell of oil. The air made my eyes sting. It took me 3 streetlights to admit that the sting had nothing to do with air. My mother went quiet after that, a chapel silence that meant prayer or punishment. She placed apologetic objects in the house, an extra loaf of bread, a new towel, like offerings. She started annotating memories as if to prove herself, the hospital band she had saved in a photo frame, the first tooth in a velvet pouch. Artifacts were not the problem. It was the caption she kept trying to force onto them, "We did this for you." In my notebook I wrote a sentence I didn't know would help until it did: "Love is a reason, not a receipt." Thomas, meanwhile, was careful in a way that made me like him against my will. He sent me medical history because he didn't want me to get blindsided by genetics, kidneys that fail early for his sister, a cousin with a clotting disorder, a grandfather who had lived well past his welcome. He did not send photos unless I asked. He did not call me anything. He signed with his own name and let me leave the space after mine blank. We agreed to a coffee in a public place 20 miles from everything we knew. He arrived early and sat with his hands around a cup like heat mattered. He looked like a man who had spent most of his life building things with his shoulders. When I sat, he didn't reach for me. He told me his son had a laugh that started low and rose, and that his wife had been the only person who could beat him at Scrabble. He said he had thought about me even when he didn't know I existed because once you know people made choices around you, your timeline gets noisy. He asked nothing except whether I wanted a second coffee. I noticed the way his thumb tapped the lid twice when he was thinking. I noticed the slope of his nose. I noticed that I was searching his face for parts of myself and coming up with an odd piece. My father's expressions lived in me more than any bones would. I left the cafe with a second cup I didn't drink and a head full of doors. I sat in my car and realized I wanted two things that complicated each other: to protect my parents from pity and to stop letting a secret use my life as a hiding place. I wrote both in the notebook and watched them exist on the same page without canceling each other. The family did what families do when someone pulls a thread. Cousins chose teams with their silence. An aunt asked at a birthday if I was going to make this a thing and then blushed at her own words. A neighbor hugged me too long without knowing why. Lila brought me a Tupperware of stuffed peppers and told me my mother had been a volcano you had to admire from a safe distance since before I was born. She said graves are full of truths we were too polite to say. I loved her for handing me a metaphor without trying to steer it. My mother's control bent toward narrative. She told church friends that I had let absent strangers confuse me. She posted an old photo of my father holding me, captioned with a verse about roots. She performed certainty in rooms that reward it. In private, she vacillated between tenderness and rage. She would place a hand on my hair and say she did not regret anything except telling me badly. Then she would accuse me of blowing up our lives because I wanted drama like in those podcasts. Both could be true in her body at once. Only one could be true in mine. The practicalities started to map themselves. A lawyer explained that presumptions of paternity are strong where we live. Legal fatherhood is a mountain, not a paper tent. He said I did not owe anyone litigation. He said I could file something to add a note to my medical records. Truth matters most when blood or marrow are needed. He said the court would not be a friend to any of us. I thanked him for telling me my options in a way that did not sound like a sales pitch. I did not file anything. I did email my doctor with a short paragraph: family history update, kidneys, clots, a man named Thomas who exists. I also wrote to Thomas's son. I introduced myself without calling myself anything. I said I wasn't coming to replace or invade. I said I'd be in town in 2 months for work and could meet for 10 minutes on a park bench. He replied that 10 minutes sounded right. When we met, he was younger than me by 3 years and older by a decade. He told me he'd always wanted a sibling but had learned to want other things. He showed me a photo of his mother because honoring her felt like a password. We sat on the bench until the light under the trees went honest, and then we stood and nodded at each other like coworkers leaving a meeting with no action items and too much implication. My father read more than he had in years. I know because he called to ask what it meant that a kidney can be shared. He did not say my name when he asked. He did not need to. I told him that I wasn't going anywhere and that my body could be a door if he ever needed one. He made a noise that was not crying because he has different words for everything. He said we should replace the seal on my mother's back door before winter because the draft would wreck her joints. We did that together on a Saturday without talking about anything else, and the way the warm air stayed inside afterward felt like a victory I could hold. The only explosion came where I least wanted it, at my grandmother's 80th, in a rented hall with plastic chandeliers. Someone had drunk the wrong courage. A cousin cornered me by the punch bowl and said the rumor must be true because my eyes looked like those hails. My mother heard the word hail, which made more noise than the music. She stiffened. Her mouth flattened. She announced to the room, in the voice she uses when she is backed into a corner and wants to make the corner look like a throne, that the devil lives in data and that no godly family puts science above vows. The room went hush. My father put a hand on her elbow and said her name softly, 2 syllables, a plea. I picked up my purse and left before the evening could turn into a tribunal. She texted later a sermon and then, an hour after that, an apology that didn't use the word sorry. I turned the phone face down. In my notebook I wrote, when people are drowning, they grab the person nearest, not the shore. Time did what it always does when you don't tell it how to behave. It stretched until everything that had been tearing found a place to sit. I kept the coffee boundary with Thomas. We emailed like pen pals who share a peculiarly intimate overlap. He sent a story about breaking his ankle at 19 and the way silence has a different taste when you live alone. I sent a story about my mother teaching me to make pierogies and how dough forgives more than you think it will. We did not pretend that a sentence could fix anything. We used them anyway. My mother went to a retreat and came back with a bead bracelet that was supposed to help with grounding. She touched the beads and tried breathing exercises that sounded like counting storms. She stopped blaming apps out loud. She started telling a new story about my conception that made her the hero of courage instead of the culprit of secrecy. I listened when I had the energy. When I didn't, I excused myself and went for a walk around the block and greeted the three-legged dog on Maple Street like a co-conspirator. My father and I rebuilt things in the language of tasks. We changed his wiper blades. We carried an old dresser to the curb. We measured the sag in the back steps. He came to hear me play one of the songs I'd written at a small bar where nobody knows anyone. He sat at a table near the back and clapped like clapping could build a roof. Afterward he put a folded 20 in my hand the way he used to when I was a teenager and said he was proud without making eye contact. Pride is a hard word for some men. He is better at actions. People expect one of two endings when you mention DNA, the welcoming porch photo with everyone squinting into the sun, or the courtroom with its bad lighting and worse chairs. I don't have either. I have a drawer where the letter sits in a plastic sleeve because paper ages and truth shouldn't. I have a father whose blood does not match mine and whose voice I would know in a building full of alarms. I have a mother who did a brave and foolish thing and then tried to keep the world from seeing the foolish part. I have a man who mailed his spit and found a daughter he didn't know how to name and did not rush to claim what wasn't his to take. Most days I feel ordinary in a new way, like I'm walking around in a body that now contains a footnote. Some days I am angrier than the facts deserve, other days I am gentler than the people do. On the worst days I think of the exact square of kitchen tile where my mother's bracelet hit the floor and the way we both stared at the tea spreading and knew the stain would outlast the day. On the best days I wake before my alarm and the light is the color of clean paper, and I make coffee and I play the same 4 chords until they stop sounding like math and start sounding like a place, and I write one line in the back of the notebook that I don't show anyone. I do not have to choose between the people who made me and the truth that explains me. I can hold both. I can live here. I told my mom I found out the truth. She collapsed before I even said the word DNA. The rest is not an ending. It's a map with some roads penciled in, some fields left blank, and a note in the corner that says, if you get lost, ask for directions from the people who admit they've been lost too.
Follow me for more stories.